All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another discussion with NoCo Housing Now. We've got an interesting panel today that will talk us through land use code and what some of the communities in our area are doing to address the impediments, some of the impediments that are faced when trying to develop housing throughout the Larimer Weld area. But just as a quick reminder, first of all, my name is Joe Rowan. I'm your moderator. And on behalf of the Fort Collins Area Chamber of Commerce, which is hosting this series, for those of you who are unfamiliar, NoCo Housing Now is a voluntary coalition of the willing that includes both public officials, administrators, advocates for housing, as well as real estate professionals that are coming together to try to identify areas in which we can start to make a dent in the discrepancy between housing demand and what's available and the costs relative to incomes. So we're trying to look at voluntary ways in which communities and participants in the industry, providing them information as well as sharing the information that they have from the field, so we have a better understanding of the issues. So today we are going to be talking about land use code. And again, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the Zoom manipulations, if you would, as the panelists present, if you have questions, please raise your hand or enter into the chat comments or questions, so that it alerts me to open your mic for you to weigh in. What we'll do is we'll have panelists from the city of Greeley, then the city of Fort Collins, excuse me, and then Larimer County. And we'll just ask that you allow them to make their introductory presentation, and then as each finishes, we can ask specific questions, but hopefully we'll get through all the presentations in about 20 minutes, or excuse me, about 25 minutes, and that'll leave plenty of time for comment and discussion amongst all of our participants. So with that, let me just start with a couple of quick items. First of all, again, my name is Joe Rowan, and presenting this on behalf of the Fort Collins Area Chamber. We do have Kaiser Permanente, which is one of our sponsors. And again, I've already kind of shared a little bit of background on who we are. But what we want to talk about today is land use code. And so just again, for those of you who are unfamiliar, land use code essentially defines what can be built, where it can be built, how much can be built, and how that property can be used over time. It does incorporate zoning limitations and any service requirements that may be necessary to develop within the county or the municipalities. And it effectively limits the amount of available land for development, simply because, again, it says how much can go on, or how intense the use can be on a given parcel of land. So just to maybe put it in visual terms, pre-land use code, this is what we had. Folks went out in the wilderness and just built what they wanted, where they wanted. And, that worked for a little while until more folks started showing up. Now we have a real estate development process that you go through. And so this really is the crux of development today, is how you get through that process and what you need to do to get an approval and actually build housing. So this is much of what our conversation is today, is this kind of process of how we get through there. So with that, I'm just going to introduce our panelists. We've got from the city of Greeley, Ben Snow, Carol Kuhn, and Mike Garrett. City of Fort Collins, we have Megan Overton and Noah Beals. From Larimer County, Matt Lafferty, Jen Cram, and Claire Bouchard. And I am, of course, your host. And I'm also going to leave this up here for just a few minutes. Here's contact information. And oh, by the way, should point out that all this information is going to be sent out to everyone that registered. It's also going to be available through their Chamber of Commerce website. Too many meetings this morning. This Fort Collins Area Chamber of Commerce website has this presentation material as well as previous presentation material. So hold on to that site and reference it frequently and share it with your colleagues. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up for City of Greeley. So Ben, you and your team are up.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Carol's going to share her screen and we'll run us through our dozen slides or so we have this morning. So I'll give her a minute to get that going.
Joe, it looks like you may have disabled screen share, so could you allow me
Oh, yes, sorry about that. Let me let's see. I am, whoops. Okay. Are you able to pull that up, Jen? Oh, Carol, excuse me. There you go.
So let's get started.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks, Carol. We also have, in addition to myself, my name is Benjamin Snow. I'm the Director for Economic Health and Housing for the City of Greeley. And I'll be co-presenting this morning alongside Carol Kuhn, who is our Chief Planner at the city. We're also joined by Mike Garrett. He's our Planning Manager, and he'll be available along with the two of us as we answer any questions folks may have. But before I turn time over to Carol as our Chief Planner, I'd like to just take a couple of minutes to provide some context to the code update as it relates to housing and talk a little bit about our strategic housing plan.
Are those slides advancing?
Yep, I'm seeing that. So,
okay, good.
So there's three foundational documents that we use to drive our efforts. The first is the City Council's vision for 2040, which includes the goal called Your Home is Here. The vision for this goal states in part that in 2040, Greeley is a distinctive, character-rich community known for its high-quality standard of living. Residents have access to an amazing variety of housing options, including style, price, and location. Secondly, we also know that the Imagine Greeley comprehensive plan encourages a range of housing options to accommodate our diverse and growing population. And finally, our strategic housing plan, which was adopted 2 years ago, outlines key steps to provide a mix of single and multifamily housing options. The community development and economic health and housing departments are each uniquely positioned to lead different strategies within the plan. And this past year, we've made some exciting updating our code, which was front and center as a need to be addressed in the plan. This housing ladder shown here is a helpful reference that we have been using to communicate housing as a holistic ecosystem. I know many of you have probably seen similar housing ladders, but we really view our job as working to address this entire system, especially any missing or underrepresented rungs. We believe the work we've done with our development code will translate in more housing developers working with us to creatively generate new housing units that make both economic sense and match the preferences of our current and future residents. So with that, I'd like to turn the balance of our time this morning over to our Chief Planner, Carol.
Thank you, Ben. Hold on one second. I'm getting multiple calls coming in and bells are going off. So one of the methods to support and implement the strategies called out in the strategic housing plan, as well as the goals, policies, and objectives identified in the Imagine Greeley comprehensive plan, is to update the city's development code, as Ben mentioned. The last comprehensive update to the development code was 23 years ago. So the city teamed with Gould Evans and Ayers Associates as working on an update to the development code. This update includes reorganizing and reformatting, streamlining and simplifying the existing code, but also we're looking at making some other changes, such as revising the PUD regulations by removing the platting requirements and making PUDs a simple one-step process, similar to a rezoning application. We're in our last phase of the update project, with the public hearing for the final track taking place on September 7th. The proposed changes in this final track include modernization of the residential zone districts to provide a full suite of housing options, updating the commercial industrial standards by incorporating form-based code principles and revising the regulations to encourage stronger placemaking strategies and right-sizing the parking requirements. So as part of the initial code analysis, we identified some missing housing types. By expanding options for these missing middle housing types, the new code would allow a variety of entry points into home ownership, as well as provide options for integrating smaller apartment and condominium projects into existing legacy neighborhoods and also some of the downtown areas. We also identified areas where accessory dwelling units would be appropriate. So the proposed code revisions would expand our housing options, reduce the minimum lot size currently at 6,000 square feet for our residential low density housing. We would reduce that to 4,500 square feet. This table shows some of the other options available. The revisions include reducing the minimum lot size in our medium density zone district to 1,500 square feet and allowing an allowance and adding an allowance for accessory dwelling units. Some of the smaller lot sizes could even include 1,000 square feet for an attached product such as a row house. The proposed regulations also shift the focus from zone district minimums and maximums to frontage type approach, thereby providing options for a variety of housing types with common elements to be integrated into new developments, as well as existing neighborhoods and areas. We're also including provisions for a courtyard development pattern, which would allow buildings to front onto a common area rather than a street. The courtyard option would provide another housing option and could either be a for sale or a for rent option. We also we evaluated some of the existing housing stock that's located throughout some of our legacy neighborhoods and our existing areas throughout the city, and we found that one of the unique aspects of these existing legacy neighborhoods is the mix of housing types. So this is something that has evolved over time, and we're trying to bring that back into the forefront to allow some of this to occur in some of our new developments, as well as encourage it in the existing areas as well. As you can see, fourplexes, duplexes, and small apartments are integrated into existing neighborhoods, but they're all tied together with common elements such as front porches, stoops, and covered entryways. The goal of the code update is to encourage this type of variety in new neighborhoods, as well as allow options for infill in the downtown area. So we ran through a few scenarios in looking at the code update and used our long block structure. And the long block structure in the before picture shows just, everybody, all the houses lined up and using our long block format. But we thought, well, let's run some scenarios and see how we could, bring some other options into these standard lot structure. So these scenarios allowed us to conceptualize new housing options. This example shows some of the options in the downtown or legacy urban neighborhood. With the existing block structure shown, the modified block structure is shown below it. And this identifies some areas where we could move to a mix of courtyard, medium, and small apartments with row houses, accessory dwelling units, and other small format housing. We also looked at took the same scenario and said, okay, in some of the newer neighborhoods, how would we create a similar mix? So this example demonstrates a similar mixing of housing options with the long block structure at the top, upper right-hand corner, and then with the after block structure shown right below it. The larger picture shows the mix of housing types, but in that more of a suburban walkable neighborhood. So we're finishing up our development code update with the public hearing, as I mentioned, before City Council on September 7th. The code update was broken into smaller bites with 3 separate tracks. All 3 of the tracks will come back to City Council on September 21st for the second reading and final adoption. We anticipate an effective date of October 1st. And as part of the update, we're going to conduct a 6-month assessment and bring back any revisions to Planning Commission and Council after we conduct an assessment. So we're looking at, any things that we maybe put in a punch list or a parking lot that needed to be addressed in the future. So we're really excited about the mix of opportunities this could bring to Greeley. We're looking forward to seeing how the code can complement and supplement the housing strategy and implement the goals and policies of the comp plan. And of course, Mike Garrett, planning manager, and Ben and I are available for questions.
Great, thanks, Carol. Thank you, Carol.
Oh, and I'm sorry, and Ben has a follow-up slide. I'm sorry, I
No, that's it. We just wanted to make ourselves available. Appreciate the time to share what we got cooking over here in Greeley. And so, Joe, I don't know if you want us to just stand by and let all of the other groups speak, and then we'll kind of have a group discussion about it, but we're good either way.
Good. Yeah, no, I think what we'll do, I don't see anything in the chat or anybody raising their hand. So I think what we'll do is just roll into the City of Fort Collins presentation. So Megan, take it away.
Okay, Joe, can you confirm that you can see the slides and just the slides? Okay, great.
Yes.
I've got a lot of stuff up here on the computer. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us today. My name's Megan Overton. I'm the housing manager for the City of Fort Collins, and I'm joined by Noah Beals, senior city planner, and I saw Sue Beck-Furcus, who's our social policy and housing programs manager, is also here today. Mostly in listening mode, but available for any specific questions that might come up. You're going to hear a lot of similar things. I was actually really happy to hear the presentation from the folks in Greeley about what they're working on. We're trying to address a lot of similar issues and concerns in Fort Collins. So I'll start with a little bit of context, and then Noah will go into some of the details of the code updates we're working on right now. So like Greeley, our code update is really based in our comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2019. And updating our code was a high priority implementation action recommended in that plan. So now we're moving forward with that after the city plan was adopted. We did an audit of the land use code to identify where we might start to make those changes, and also adopted the city's housing strategic plan last year. So all of those documents kind of add up to, hey, the code's been around for a long time. It's been updated, annually or biannually, but we haven't looked at it comprehensively since it was adopted in 1997. So it's time to really adjust and modernize the code for the kinds of housing and the kinds of kind of community we want to build based on those policy documents. This is the first phase of a code update that we expect to take around 4 years total. So we'll be looking at the whole code. We're starting with housing specific code changes and some code reorganization, and then we'll address commercial and industrial uses and anything else we weren't able to get to in phase 2. So right now we're at the beginning of phase 1. And the alignment with the housing strategic plan that was just adopted, this code update is really looking at several different key outcomes. We're looking to increase housing supply and thereby affordability, increasing housing diversity and choice, and improving housing equity as well. So there are a few things we know already from our other policy documents and analysis we've done so far. We know that we're not producing enough affordable housing. The city has a goal to have 10% of our housing stock as deed restricted and affordable by 2040. And essentially that means that we need to more than double our annual production or preservation of affordable housing on an annual basis. So we're behind and we need to catch up, and the code update is looking to remove barriers and help us achieve those housing production goals for deed restricted affordable housing. We also know that we don't have enough housing supply broadly, whether it's affordable or market rate. You saw those rungs of the housing spectrum in the Greeley presentation. Essentially, no matter where you are, there's not enough housing. And Fort Collins City Plan estimates estimate that we will probably, the demand for housing will exceed capacity by about 2,000 units, maybe more, maybe less, depending on growth rates over time. But we're going to run out of housing stock, and that's already very constrained in our market. I'd just like to explain the kind of circle chart on the bottom left here. This is showing existing land use. This was from City Plan, so it's a few years old. But what you can see here is that a lot of the city and growth management area land is in open space, agriculture, and low density residential development. And in this case, low density means 5 or fewer dwelling units per acre. So all of this here is either open space or that low density residential development. So as you might expect, our housing mix is predominantly single family homes with a good portion of multifamily housing, and that's been increasing over time. You heard the Greeley presentation talk about missing middle housing. That's right here. It's a small percentage of our housing, and that's something that we'd like to encourage more of and see more development of as we move through these code updates. And this graph is essentially showing what we think that might look like. You know, right now we're mostly single family, really looking to expand this missing middle housing, accessory dwelling units, and then keeping a good portion of multifamily development as well. Now I'm going to hand it over to Noah, and he's going to get into some of the nitty-gritty details. And then if you really want to dig into the details, we can talk about this for days. So please ask us questions when we get there. So Noah, go ahead.
Yeah, again, Noah Beals. I'm with the city of Fort Collins. I've been a planner for a while here. And really a lot of what we're doing with our land use code update builds on what we did with city plan and with the housing strategic plan. And the first step that we wanted to do here is look at our equity and opportunity and opportunities that we have in the city, meaning that we know that housing challenges or pricing challenges affect our BIPOC community and our low income communities just really disproportionately. And so we wanted to create an equity and opportunity assessment to identify geographically where in the city that's going to occur. And so we have our consultants on board already doing that diagnostic and producing that map, and we hope to get it here in September and report back to our council and our residents on our findings on that. So again, we're really in an implementation phase here, and with all the work that we did with our housing strategic plan, they identified goals and priorities already in there and strategies, and we're looking to implement those with our land use code update, especially here in phase 1. And like Megan said, we just know there's not enough housing stock, let alone affordable housing stock. And so with our phase 1, we're really looking to remove the barriers in our land use code that prevents housing from being built. And so grateful that council appropriated some funding for us to do this and to move forward with that. Yeah. So we hired our consultant. Our team is Samantha Sutter from Meta Urban Design, and she hired Peter Park from City Planning and Design, and they're a great team lead in this, and they have some consultants that they work with as well, Cascadia and Equity Policy Solutions. It was important for us to have these team members here because we think they're a great team to help us lead with that equity lens and really provide some solid data on what improvements we're going to propose and how to model that. And that's what Cascadia is going to be helping us with as well. So where are we at? We're quarter 3, quarter 4 here this year. We're going to start our public engagement here in September, and then we're going to do some get the analysis and modeling back from our partners here, and then we're going to begin to draft some code changes. We hope that draft of code changes happens here in November, that we can bring that out to the public to start looking at, and then do some further refinements to that within that last quarter and the beginning of next quarter. Or the first quarter of next year, and then create a final draft for adoption, hopefully in quarter 2 of next year. But we're moving fast, and again, we're already in this implementation stage. That's what a lot of that work, that public engagement stuff, happened during our housing strategic plan as we're adopting that. But really in this phase one, we want to, again, look at the different barriers that we have to housing and look at the missing middle opportunities that we can create, including opportunities for ADUs throughout more of the city than we already have. And then the other part of phase one is just reorganizing our code a little bit and just removing some of the redundancies that happen and simplifying the language and providing clarity, because there's a lot of gray wording in our code, and we want to make sure that everybody has clarity on what it means. So, our next steps will be, newsletters and updates on what we're doing. Again, we're going to be doing community outreach in September and October. A lot of that the first part is going to be informative, talking about the different strategies that already came out of the housing strategic plan, and then and getting some input on where we're headed after we get some more diagnostics from our consultant. I think that's the last slide.
Yeah, I think that's it for us. So as soon as I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen, go. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for that presentation. Again, I'm not seeing anyone's hand up or in the chat, so we'll move over to Larimer County.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Can everybody screen?
We can see your screen, Jen. Thanks.
Great. Joe, thank you so much for including Larimer County in this conversation. I am joined this morning by Claire Bouchard, Housing Stability Program Manager, as well as Leslie Ellis, Community Development Director. And I see that we have two of our county commissioners, Commissioner Kofalis and Commissioner Shattuck McNally here as well. And so Larimer County has engaged Clarion to assist us with our land use code updates. And so this is actually phase 2 of the land use code update. Larimer County, I'll get to that slide in a moment, but we did update our comprehensive plan in 2019, and it had some very specific goals and policies for housing. And so as part of the land use code phase 2 updates, we're looking at housing, as well as development standards, RV parks and campgrounds, urban agriculture and the keeping of livestock, our Estes Valley regulations, and 1041. We've already adopted updates to our signage code as well as oil and gas. So housing is part of these phase 2 updates. So with regard to housing, we are really looking at what we can do to increase the options for housing and attainability in Larimer County. We're looking at all aspects of Larimer County, including agricultural labor housing, manufactured housing parks, tiny houses on wheels, accessory dwelling units, and looking at our definition of a family and living unit definitions. As noted, the comprehensive plan was updated in 2019. And the goal of the land use code updates is to better align with the comprehensive plan, as well as making the land use code more user-friendly. And so the comprehensive plan identified 3 key principles and policies related to housing needs, diversity, and the land division and residential planning. Both the comprehensive plan and land use code updates are joined by some strategic plan focus. And as part of our strategic plan, we did just complete a needs assessment for housing. So the land use code phase 2 updates align with what we learned from that needs assessment. So with regard to agricultural labor housing, currently, the land use code really just allows for dormitory style housing. And so with this update, we have created a new definition, and we're looking at a multitude of options, including co-housing, RVs for temporary use, and all of those things to allow for more flexibility for that needed agricultural housing. With regard to manufactured housing parks, we are proposing updates that clarify setback requirements, align with off-street parking space and paving requirements, connectivity, increasing the percentage of outdoor recreation required, as well as maintenance requirements. The big policy question that we we're asking our Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners is whether or not the manufactured home park zoning districts should be refined to help protect these existing parks. We've done some research, and there are approximately 70 RV parks in all of Larimer County. Approximately 33 of those manufactured home parks are in unincorporated Larimer County. As phase 1 of our land use code updates, the zone district of M1 multifamily was rezoned to manufactured home park. And so about half of the manufactured home parks in unincorporated Larimer County transitioned to that MHP, or manufactured home park zone district, and others are in other zone districts such as O Open or UR1, CC Commercial, Core. And so we're looking at whether or not we would refine the manufactured home park district to minimize the potential for new conflicts, and whether or not the existing manufactured home parks in those other zone districts should be rezoned to the MHP zone district so that there can be further protection. So I'd like to just take this opportunity to add that we're currently working on phase 2 of the land use code. There will likely be additional phases that we can accomplish some of these goals from the comprehensive plan, including a closer look at manufactured home parks. Tiny houses on wheels are a hot topic in Larimer County. Everyone would like to locate a tiny house on wheels in Larimer County, multiple tiny houses, preferably. And so Larimer County currently only allows 1 dwelling per parcel. You do have the ability to get approval of an accessory dwelling. The challenge that we have, as you all know, is that currently with state regulations and building code regulations, it's difficult for us to allow a tiny home that is manufactured off-site as a permanent dwelling. There's currently nothing in our land use regulations that prohibits someone from doing a small footprint home in Larimer County, but the tiny houses on wheels is a challenge. So in preparation for, what we are hopeful that we will see some changes with state legislation and building codes so that tiny houses on wheels can be allowed as a permanent dwelling. In preparation for that, we have added tiny houses on wheels as a temporary use type. We also have a new definition for tiny houses on wheels that differentiates them from RVs, and they would be allowed in all RV parks. Next is the accessory dwelling unit. So we have updated our standards to include design guidelines with regard to, parking and the scale of the unit. Currently in Larimer County, you can get approval of an accessory dwelling unit through the administrative special review process. That accessory dwelling unit is limited to 800 square feet or 40% of the square footage of the primary residence, or 800 square feet, whichever is less. And so we see a lot of appeals to that 800 square foot limit. And so we are looking at increasing the square footage maximums in the urban areas to 900 square feet, and in the mixed center areas to 1,000 feet, and then in the rural and conservation and agricultural zone districts to 1,200 square feet. Our hope is that we can minimize the number of appeals that we see, making these accessory dwelling units more livable, and really basing it on a contextual basis, that a larger accessory dwelling unit would have less impacts on neighbors if it's on a larger lot. So we are seeing positive feedback on changing these maximum standards. We've also considered whether or not an accessory dwelling unit should just be a use by right in all residential zone districts with contextual standards for size. And so the feedback that we've received on this proposal is that we don't want to open the floodgates just yet. We definitely want to have the opportunity for public notice and, you know, neighbor input on these things. But we're definitely looking at increasing the size. And then the next big policy question, currently in Larimer County, accessory living areas cannot be rented. They can only be used for family and friends or in exchange for labor. And so we believe that allowing these accessory living areas, approved accessory living areas, that renting them long-term is going to help to provide, again, another diversity of the type of housing in Larimer County. And we asked the question as to whether or not they should be allowed to be rented short-term. And the feedback that we've heard unanimously is that short-term rentals would be prohibited in Larimer County. And then going back to the tiny house on wheels question, you know, once the building code and state regulations are not a barrier, we all agree that a tiny house on wheels should be allowed to function as an accessory dwelling unit. With regard to our definition of, you know, family and living unit, we think that we're hitting the mark here. We'll be making some minor adjustments to make sure that the definition of family is inclusive to all types of families. And then the living unit would include one family plus up to 2 additional individuals to allow, again, for flexibility for long-term rentals and things. And so we just asked the question because some of these accessory dwelling units are a little bit smaller. Does it make sense to allow for an entire living unit to occupy an accessory dwelling unit, or should it be limited, you know, based on the square footage? And so we're still working through that, but, you know, we want to make these accessory dwelling units that are appropriate for a family to allow for a family to live there, or living unit. And so we currently have a housing questionnaire on our website. We welcome everybody to provide us feedback. We are taking the latest draft of housing regulations to the Planning Commission on September 22nd for a work session to make sure that we're hitting the mark on all of these topics. And then we're proposing to post the adoption draft of the housing regulations to our website on September 24th. And then we would tentatively, we're looking to bring the proposed changes to the Planning Commission for their recommendation on October 13th, and then to the Board of County Commissioners on October 25th. And I missed mentioning someone very important to this conversation. Matt Lafferty is our principal planner. He regretted not being able to join us today, but he's with the city of Fort Collins doing a Fossil Creek reservoir tour today. And so both Matt and I are available to assist with any questions or comments. As I said, phase 2 updates are focused on these topics, but there will be subsequent topics related to housing in the near future. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jen. Appreciate that. Let's see, it looks like we're starting to get some questions popping up. So first, let me throw it to Dan Hunt. Dan, you want to pose your question? Are you on mute?
Sorry, had to find it. I want to get some sense of how the kinds of feedback and blowback or positive comments you're getting with these different programs as you're handing them out to the public as to what you're hoping to do.
So I think that, is that directed at anyone in particular, Dan, or?
Yeah, anybody.
Each of them, okay.
I'm happy to chime in with regard to Larimer County. Again, we're looking at housing in unincorporated Larimer County. So, you know, increased density and things like that are limited to areas where we have access to public services, public water and sewer, et cetera. And so we do have intergovernmental agreements with City of Fort Collins, Berthoud, Loveland. And so we are looking closely at what they're doing with their housing regulations so that our zone districts that are within those growth management areas, can evolve with what their standards are. So with these topics that we have introduced, we've received very positive feedback that we're headed in the right direction, and we're at least starting to crack the nut on providing a diversity of types of housing that will help with the attainability situation in Larimer County.
And to answer that question related to the city of Greeley, we worked with a home builders focus group. So we asked some of the larger home builders that have done projects recently within the city and asked them to participate in some of the revisions to the design standards and looking at the changes to the minimum sizes and the other pieces related to the residential housing options, and including expanding our mobile home zone district to include micro housing, tiny homes, and other pieces. So we've renamed it to a micro housing zone district. And the feedback we got from the home builders was very positive. They were excited about bringing in some of these other options. We've also included a housing diversity table in to the code, where if you have hit a certain threshold, you have to have a certain mix of housing types. You can't just have all of one. So we're really trying to encourage that mix and variety.
And I can jump into Fort Collins and just say we're a little bit earlier in our process than either Greeley or the county are. So I think hopefully we'll get a lot more feedback when we're proposing more specific changes. But so far, I think what I'd characterize it as is cautious optimism. I think regardless of folks' concerns, if people want to be able to build more easily, or they want to be able to follow a process of what's happening in their neighborhood more easily, it seems like folks recognize that the code needs to be kind of brought up to speed and to match with the community better. So, folks are looking forward to seeing what the proposals are, and hopefully we can have some really good conversations about how to calibrate things so that the code can kind of grow up along with the city and with our policy documents too. So far so good. I'm sure we'll have some tensions that will come up, and we'll be navigating those all together in the engagement process this fall.
Thanks.
Joe, I'd like to add a little context as well too.
Sure.
To where we are, at least Greeley. When you look at our population of roughly 115,000 people, we're not even halfway built out yet when you think about making land use changes. So naturally there's going to be more resistance to implementing some of these density conversations in existing neighborhoods, as opposed to making them implemented on all the new stuff that's yet to come here. So I think to Megan's point, as we kind of grow up with new rules, it allows for this more diversity and more flexibility with stuff that hasn't been developed yet, rather than trying to force feed it down existing neighborhoods where we have those conversations, but as you can imagine, there's a little bit more resistance in those established neighborhoods to change the way things have been.
Great. Thank you. Nick Hawes, you have a question sounds like for all the agencies.
Sure. I was just wondering how much dialogue has occurred with the utility providers and fire departments. We found it to be challenging often to implement some of these different housing options and types because those other codes are not caught up to allow them. So just curious where they are in their journey, or what dialogue, if the land use code and planning documents are encouraging and allowing some other housing options and types, will that actually be able to be implemented or restricted by utility and fire codes? And then related, some of the impact fee schedules, particularly water and sewer, because those often are very high. So for example, if a tiny home on wheels is still having to pay, $50,000 for their water sewer impact fees, is that at odds with making an affordable housing choice?
Does anyone want to take that challenge?
Well, I can speak to what we've done with this in the city of Greeley. We worked very closely. We had a technical committee as part of the code update. We really worked, the code update took place in the matter of 9 months. So we did it in very, very quick time where we were actually drafting and revising and working with our committees. We had an advisory committee of outside citizens, and we had our technical committee. And as part of the technical committee, we worked very closely with fire, our public works department, streets, and our water and sewer folks. They helped us, make sure that the lot sizes would still have ample room for, drainage and utilities. And fire looked at some of the narrower street option that we're providing and making sure that that would still work with fire. So we feel comfortable with the changes. And as far as working with water and sewer for the smaller, the courtyard pattern and maybe some of these smaller micro housing types, we are exploring options for master meters instead of individual taps. And so we're working through that on a case-by-case basis with them.
Megan, do you want to go next, or I can chime in for Larimer County? It's a pretty quick answer. Larimer County, unincorporated Larimer County, is a little bit different than the incorporated municipalities, in that we have several water districts and sewer districts that we work with. So we understand that water and sewer are some of the biggest challenges to attainable housing. And so with that, we are working on a water plan. We're in the very beginning of that, but to convene with our water districts and sewer districts to see if we can come to an understanding with the common goal, looking at the region, because you're right, it doesn't make sense for a tiny house on wheels to have to pay a full water tap fee. And so we're hoping that our water districts will be open to that conversation and that we can make some shifts there, because some later updates to the land use code would allow for land divisions that would create ownership opportunities on smaller parcels and things. And so we are planning to have those conversations.
Megan,
I might chime in.
Or yeah, please.
Yeah, might chime in here for Fort Collins. I will say, with our phase one, we've created an internal team of different departments, and we haven't definitely included our utilities partners in this discussion. And really with our phase one, we're really just looking at the land use code at this time, but we definitely are including our utility partners in hoping to further that discussion with them in addressing kind of next steps for them in updating their codes to be in line with what we're doing. And again, further that discussion as Nick mentioned, right? There's definitely capital expansion costs to new dwelling units, and then also just standards for utility separations that really come into conflict when we're trying to create more dwelling units in a smaller area. So they're definitely at the table having a conversation with us. And we hope there's going to be more steps even after our land use code update that will further these goals.
Thanks, Noah. Adam, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks everyone for the presentations. Couple questions I have. So I really like the Greeley's kind of thought processes on the cluster or cottage style homes. I think that's a good way to represent density increases to the public, but how, I know you're all in different parts of your community outreach. How do you plan on addressing we want density, but we don't want it in our backyard, which seems to be very loud, very vocal. Anytime you even say a hint of density increase, any of these council or commission meetings and emails. So have you looked to address the pushback to the city needs that we need to increase density? And that's one of the questions. And then the second question is the fee stack and the hard costs, the lumber and the material costs, you have no influence on. But the things you do have influence on also is impacting the ability to build a smaller home at a cost-effective ability from these builders. So even if the land use code states that you can build 1,000 square foot home or a tiny home or whatever, cluster style homes, the current fee stack and the permit fees and just the time it takes to build does not allow for those homes to be built without building them at a loss. So what's your kind of thought process on that side of things to kind of mirror with the land use code changes?
We want to go in reverse order and maybe have Fort Collins address that one first.
Sure, I will do my best. So I'm just trying to keep them in mind. So first was the neighborhood density discussion. And I think, you know, it's really tempting to kind of frame that conversation as either you want density or you don't want density. And I think it's more complex than that. I think there are a lot of homeowners and renters who would like to see more options in their neighborhoods, but want it to fit in. And there are lots of ways to have that conversation, and people want more transit. And transit requires more units and more density to adequately serve it. So it's a hard community conversation to have, but we need to. And we've been having pieces of that conversation for the last several years, and it's going to kind of get down to the details in the code change in a way that's really going to call that question of, you know, these are the things that we say we want. This is what that's going to potentially look like, and how can we make that work for the community as a whole. So that's how we're talking about it right now. With the fee question and the you know, hard costs, you're right, there's not a lot we can do to control that. We are looking at process improvements for development review as a piece of this, because, you know, we recognize that if the process takes longer, it costs more money and creates more risk for the development community to get those units in the ground. So that is one thing we are looking at. And I think what you bring up, Adam, is how many different layers there are on getting a house built. You know, there are the rules and regulations, then there's the utility stuff, then there's the fee stuff on top of that, and the permitting process. So you're absolutely right that they all need to work together, and something has to be out in front. And I think for Fort Collins, that's going to be this land use code update. One of the things that needs to come out of that when it's adopted is very clear next steps. So now that we've changed these things in our code, we need to update this fee schedule, and we need to update these utility regulations to make sure that, like our comprehensive plan and our land use code should be connected, and it took some time to get to this point. That's probably going to be those like very distinct next step projects that need to come after these code changes are adopted. So maybe not, it's not great that we can't do it all at once, but trying to be as realistic as we can with what we can accomplish in a short period of time too.
And I think, Jen, do you want to?
Sure. So again, unincorporated Larimer County is in a different situation from the incorporated areas. The reason that accessory dwelling units aren't currently allowed to be rented is because of that density issue. And, you know, people choose to live in unincorporated Larimer County because they're looking for more of a rural character, single family homes. And so, you know, we're taking a big step forward and looking at allowing these to be rented long-term. And we are looking at, you know, the impacts to neighbors of having an accessory dwelling unit and potentially another family living there. And so that's why we're looking at those context issues, such as, you know, the size of the lot and things, as well as availability of public water and sewer and things like that. You know, those are the basic things that allow for increased density. And so with increased density, we would likely see those in the growth management areas and urban areas surrounding that. And that was the reason that we decided not to, one of the reasons we decided not to just allow accessory dwelling units by right is that we want to hear from neighbors. We want to know how having that accessory dwelling impacts their lifestyle and things like that. So for right now, we will have a process for the accessory dwelling units. And I'll echo what Megan said, is that this is a level approach. It would be wonderful if we could address all of these things at once. The land use code updates to better align with the comprehensive plan is the first step. And then we'll also be looking at our processes and fee structures and things like that following the land use code updates.
Yeah, Carol, you want to add?
Sure. So one of the things we explored with the code was, you can do density just for the sake of density, or you can do density the right way. And what we were hoping was, with all the design features that we were working in to the code, looking at common elements that can bring the same features, carrying over some of the same aspects. We were hoping that could really help mitigate some of the concerns about density. And we carefully discussed the accessory dwelling units as well as an option to add some additional density into the existing areas. And council directed us to go into the medium density areas, and protecting our legacy areas. And for the new developments, we really could shift the minimum lot sizes down to 4,500. But in our residential low density, maintaining that larger lot size and kind of keeping the existing as it is. So we really see this really in more of the transitional areas happening. So where the infrastructure is already there, where the roads are already there, where the services are already there, and where the parks, trails, open space, and all of those recreation centers. So really pushing the density where it belongs.
Thank you. Jen, there's a quick question maybe you can answer that Megan posted relative to the size of the ADUs. You have 900 to 1,200. I think, Megan, your question is, how did you come up with those numbers?
Yeah, so we worked with Clarion on this and asked them to look at other communities in our area and what their accessory dwelling unit size were. And so we based it off of that, as well as our experience with the appeals going before the Board of County Commissioners. And so we kind of tried to find that sweet spot in between with what people were requesting, what made sense for the lot size, and what other municipalities were doing in our area.
Thank you. Councilmember Peel, you have a few questions.
I do actually, because I'm just learning this, and so forgive me if my questions sound ignorant. I don't mean for them to, but are there instances where the city land use code and the county land use code conflicts?
I think we're both virtually looking at each other like, who's going to go first?
I believe that our intergovernmental agreement for the growth management areas is working well. Our areas where it conflicts in some places, but I think that that's minor. And I think that we have a great working relationship, and we're looking at those things whenever we have a project that comes into Larimer County that's within a growth management area. We always look at the structure plan for the city of Fort Collins or city of Loveland to make sure we're moving forward with consistency. And so our review criteria look at compatibility with that growth management area and underlying plans. And so I think it's very timely that both City of Fort Collins and Larimer County are looking at their land use code updates and comprehensive plan. And so I enjoy working with Megan and Noah. I'm actually working with them on their strategic plan. And so I think that there's a lot of room for improvement as we move forward.
Yeah, I would just echo that and saying that the timing is really good. And it's actually great that the county conversations, especially about these kind of innovative or different kinds of housing types, are out a little bit ahead of the city process too. So that whatever our updated regulations are can talk well with each other. For Fort Collins and the county, really that area where things overlap is those properties that are outside city limits, but inside the growth management area. And that's really the areas where we want to make sure that the regulations for the county and the city are sending a similar message, even if they might have slightly different content because we're different regulatory agencies.
Okay. And then I don't want to take up a lot of time on this, but I had a question from my constituent the other day about the deed restrictions. So I think I'm specifically addressing Fort Collins on this issue. And so they were concerned about the consequences of deed restricting properties. Do you see these consequences, and are we addressing those?
What consequences were they concerned about?
I think his concern was that if we are deed restricting, then there's no, the homeowner doesn't get the benefit of the building up equity.
I see. Yeah. So Fort Collins has very small number of deed restricted home ownership units. And I see Sue coming on, and welcome her to clarify or correct anything that I get wrong in my response to. A lot of times a deed restricted home ownership unit is structured as a kind of shared equity agreement where the person who's purchasing that unit achieves a certain defined amount of equity over time in that home. And the point of that is to try to get them to a point where they can purchase a home that's not deed restricted and continue in the ownership market. So it's a kind of entry into home ownership rather than intended to be a massive wealth building opportunity. And that's very intentional with those deed restricted home ownership units to offer that to not just the first purchaser, but the purchaser after that and the purchaser after that to really create a pathway into home ownership. So it's absolutely correct that deed restriction for home ownership would limit the equity for any individual buyer. And that it's one tool to get people into home ownership who otherwise might not be able to get into the market. So definitely trade-offs. It is different than just having a market-based system without restrictions, but does have some benefits for folks to get into home ownership. And Sue, I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add to that as well.
I think you did a great job, Megan, of explaining it. And I think that, I look at it sort of as home ownership on training wheels to see if it is the right move for people, because home ownership isn't for everyone. And it does allow home ownership for people who simply could not achieve it without some kind of a program to help them. And I really like, Megan, that you included that if it all works well, people will get into the regular market and have full appreciation after they've tried it on, they know what's for them, and their situation stabilizes. But restricted home ownership is also very often used with a community land trust, and hopefully we're going to see more of that in our community, and that even has more supports for these early homeowners.
And just really quickly, are we seeing success with that in Fort Collins? Are people moving on to the next level?
People in the Provincetown condominiums definitely are. And that's our best example to date. And that was an early experimental project that had a 25-year restriction. So we definitely see those selling, and they have a formula that has a ceiling that people have not yet had a problem with. So that appreciation formula has worked very much for the homeowners.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to share too. I have if you want to nerd out on this a little bit, I have saved somewhere an article that was basically looking at these kinds of shared equity models across the nation and whether they do help people get into home ownership or not. And I found it really useful to just kind of get a bigger picture of what this deed restricted home ownership idea is doing and how it's performed over time. So I'd be happy to send that to Joe. And he can share it with folks if they want to see that too. It's a little bit old, but has some good information in it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and do feel free to send that to me, Megan. I'll make sure it gets into our library. Julie Stone, you have a question.
I think it's somewhere in between Commissioner Peel and Adam. I was just curious if you're finding, given that you're updating so many of your strategic plans and that this conversation largely stems from wanting to then align land use policy, are you running into sticking points or places where the overarching state policy around land use is holding you back in some way from something you'd otherwise really want to do? And said differently, or maybe to add one layer to that, are there things that you wish could be different about state level land use policy or otherwise that would actually help you get where you're going that don't currently exist? So I guess I'm curious about the balance between the local control and optionality that goes into this process versus what you're experiencing at the state level. And if those considerations seem to both have to be in play, or if it really is, you feel like you have all the tools you need.
Carol, do you want to jump on that one?
Sure. I don't think that we've really come into, being a home rule municipality as Fort Collins is. We haven't really come in across any of the conflicts with any of the state regulations. Our development code was already regulating a lot of these things. It was really scattered throughout the whole code. We had a lot of these design standards. They seemed to be a little arduous. The small lot was an option under a cluster development, but only allows you to go down to 4,500 square feet. So we don't really think that, we haven't really seen any conflicts with any of the state regulations. And, we're really just enhancing what we already had, organizing it, and then bringing some of the form-based code concepts into it. So I don't really think we've had any.
I'm happy to jump in as well on that one. Our county commissioners are very forward thinking and have started the conversation with our state representatives on the tiny house issue. And there is interest in moving that forward. We currently have a proposal with CCI. And so I think that's the area right now that Larimer County is really interested in making a shift on a state level, is with changing regulations for tiny homes so that, again, we have more flexibility for housing types in Larimer County. So we are optimistic that this will move forward. Everybody has expressed interest in this, and so stay tuned. We hope to make some progress on this in the coming year.
Great,
and
thank you.
I'll share just a couple quick things. So I do know that, and this is more of a policy discussion in Fort Collins, but the recent legislative change that enables inclusionary housing and the specific kind of criteria that municipalities have to have put in place to do inclusionary zoning, like allow additional density or accessory dwelling units. I think that's it gives us another tool. Whether we move forward with that or not, it lets us have a conversation more fully about what we'd want to accomplish with inclusionary housing. And for folks who are unfamiliar, that would basically be an ordinance that would require a certain percentage of affordable units in new development. Fort Collins has talked about that off and on several times, but haven't had the full conversation because it always kind of ended with, yes, but we can't do that for rental because it's prohibited at the state level. And this is not me saying we should or shouldn't do that, but it's really great that we can have the conversation and then make that decision as a municipality about what's best for us. And I think the support at the state level for some of the land use code changes and different housing types and increasing housing capacity is is really helpful because that density conversation is very challenging for all of us. So, any direction to continue along that path will always help if we're kind of moving in the same direction as a state and trying to address the housing capacity challenges we have together.
Thank you. Maddie Grigg, you have a question.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat here, but one of the aspects of the presentation from Fort Collins was about displacement and making sure that folks aren't displaced from their homes. And I think that there's definitely a financial component to that, but I think that environment is also a key factor, making sure that the conditions are livable. And with, the recent IPCC report and all of the changes that we're seeing to the climate, and especially for us locally with our, fires and heavy smoke and air quality that's not always the best. I wanted to know if the land use code would account for development, specifically large industrial complexes, maybe next to places where there is affordable housing, which would be purchased by folks who are maybe low income, and also ensuring that equity to considering, the racial wealth gap and how that affects housing, knowing that this is an intersection that also involves race and ethnicity as well. So I just wanted to know what the land use code can account for in terms of these things. So as things are mapped out, that's also taken into consideration.
I'm happy to start, and then other folks can jump in if they want. So I really appreciate the question, because the equity kind of bedrock of both the housing strategic plan and the land use code updates is one that I think we're really excited about, and we're starting to get lots of questions from other city departments that are also really excited about how to think about equity geographically. And that's not something that we have a lot of tools for yet within the city. So that access to opportunity and equity assessment that is kind of the first step in the land use code is not just looking at the negative inequities, but also where there's access to opportunities. And once we have that information geographically in the community, it's a more data-informed conversation we can have about what are we incentivizing in the code, what kinds of inequities do we see, and how can we address them, whether that's through the land use code or future capital investments that the city might make, or where do our gaps in the sidewalks line up with areas of opportunity where we might want to encourage more affordable housing. So there are lots of conversations we can have more effectively if we have the information. So that's kind of our first step, is to look at those different indices and see what we can learn about what we hear about anecdotally and see in some of the data with racial wealth gaps, or with infrastructure gaps, or historical information. What does that look like today, and what can we do to ensure that not only are we not disproportionately impacting anyone, but how are we also providing access to areas that have good opportunities for nature? And to your question earlier, with trees in your neighborhood, and sidewalks that work, and jobs and good schools, and all of those things as well. So it's going to be a really good starting point for lots of conversations, land use code and otherwise.
I would echo what Megan said about that. Again, Larimer County would be looking at appropriate locations for increased density and attainable housing, so that there's access to public infrastructure, transit, and things like that. In general, all land use code looks at where uses are appropriate and a compatibility of uses. And so as part of our phase 2 updates, we are looking at our development standards and have proposed some additional buffering and screening, separation of uses so that, you know, looking at what use was there first, was it an industrial use first and then a residential is coming in, or vice versa, so that we can mitigate some of the negative impacts through buffering and things like that. And then in general, I want to note that our commissioners are looking at a climate smart program. And so Larimer County is really making sure that all of these programs are interconnected and how they influence one another. So we're looking at, you know, we'll be looking at how the climate smart program can influence future land use code updates. So more to come on that.
And from the Greeley perspective, I echo what the other two have mentioned. You know, you look at compatibility. Any new zoning, rezoning applications would need to be consistent with the comprehensive plan, and that already looked at some of those, how those edges fit together. We are introducing 2 new mixed use zone districts to kind of create that sense of place and bring that synergy and the village concept into our city. That was one of the strategic housing goals, and also in council's 3-year priorities, really pushing a village concept. But the compatibility would be key in those mixed use zone districts. So it would be a mixed use low, which would be compatible to our more car oriented commercial low, and our mixed use high, which are compatible to the commercial high. As far as the industrial pieces, you know, it would have to be consistent with our comp plan, and all of that was explored in 2018 with the comprehensive plan. We did explore some options for some of our legacy neighborhoods. We have a neighborhood that has the highest level of home ownership. It's an older area of town. It does have some industrial zoning with single family residential uses inside at one point in time, the code did allow for you to have a single family home in an industrially zoned property. And so we've really modified and made some provisions that would allow for those existing uses to remain and also to expand, as we addressed that in our nonconformity section of the code as well, and looked at ways for them to expand their property and, you know, refinance. And so we're really looking at some of those pieces as well in other aspects of the code. But any new rezoning would need to meet the compatibility and be consistent with the comprehensive plan.
Great, thank you. Sarah, did you have a follow-up to that question?
Are you asking me, Cyrus?
Yes.
Oh, hi, thank you so much for that. No, I didn't have a follow-up. I just wanted to say I also share that question. I thank you all so much.
Okay, great, thank you. Commissioner Kafalis, you have a question regarding manufactured home communities.
Yeah, Joe, thank you very much. So my question is, what consideration is being given to incentivize support resident-owned communities? And while I understand that this is more of a policy discussion, as we look to update our zoning districts like the county is doing, like the city is working on, what provisions can we include that would you know, further preserve, protect this type of unsubsidized affordable housing, and how that might relate to encouraging, supporting resident-owned communities?
So reverse order still, Joe?
Yes.
So one of the elements, we just recently approved a PUD for a mobile home community, and so it's one of the first ones in several years in the city. And with but the minimum lot size for that was 8 acres. So the minimum size for the project was 8 acres. So we've right-sized that with our micro housing zone district, setting that at 4 acres. Adding some provisions, you know, for amenities and right-sizing that towards, you know, the smaller homes, making sure that services were provided around the area, you know, where they were going to put them in, make sure that it was the right fit and they had services and transit and other things that would help support the community. So we have been exploring that, and we're hoping that we can expand some more options with that small footprint housing. So we think that the new code language will really encourage that, and we'll even get another, you know, some more opportunities with applications coming in. But we did just recently approve one. It's been a while. I'm not sure when the last one was, but we just recently approved one in 2020. So we're seeing a lot of that, interest in that, especially with the tiny homes. And the feedback about our micro housing was that, it really might provide some additional opportunities to encourage that for home ownership.
Oh, sorry, Joe, were you?
Jen, did you have something to?
I was going to let Megan go, and then I can, for those of you, I know Commissioner Caballos is knows what we're doing, but I was going to give everybody an update, but I'll let Megan go first.
Ooh, I'm excited to hear the update too. Within Fort Collins, most recently the Hickory Village manufactured home community was up for sale. And actually I haven't gotten an update on that one in a little while. I don't know that it's resolved either direction, but the city council did authorize funding to support the resident-owned communities initiative, driven mostly by the residents in Hickory Village and with Thistle as an investment and support partner in that. What that brought up for all of us is, okay, that's good, but what about next time? And what's our consistent policy for how the city approaches efforts to create resident-owned communities? So we don't have a formal policy adopted yet. That is something that we have a team that's working on manufactured housing, resident rights, and code enforcement concerns. So that work includes an effort to try to systematize things a little bit. One of the things that we are seeing too is, there's the money piece of resident-owned communities, and there's the capacity and organizing piece, and working with residents in manufactured home communities to support that neighborhood association formation and other things that need to be in place to be able to move quickly when there is an opportunity for conversion to a resident-owned community. That's another piece of the conversation, and we do have a neighborhood liaison type position who's working very closely with several manufactured home communities right now to try to lay some of that groundwork and learn more about how the city can play an effective support role for those neighborhoods in Fort Collins.
Great, thanks, Megan.
With regard to Larimer County, the current phase 2 updates will not address this issue, but the conversation has been started. And so we are looking at future updates that would allow for land divisions so that there could be smaller lot sizes for tiny homes. We've also introduced a new housing type of co-housing, so that would allow for community ownership of a project. And so that is a step forward. And so we will be looking to our municipal neighbors to see how they move forward with this and continue to have this conversation. Again, as you know, there are certain things that can be addressed in the land use code with, how we use the land, and then other things that would be a bigger policy issue. And so we're excited that this conversation has started. And again, we'll be looking to make, where we can make improvements in the land use code and where it's a bigger policy issue.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters, but thank you for joining us for the rest of our audience participants. Welcome your input in this process. And so we look forward to bringing you on for future events. But once again, thank you to each of our presenting teams from the city of Greeley, city of Fort Collins, Larimer County. Really appreciate your hard work on this and look forward to seeing the final product in the coming months. So thanks so much. Just a quick shout out for those of you who want to continue to participate in these discussions. Our next event is going to be held on October 28th. It will be a hybrid annual summit. So it'll be held in person at the Embassy Suites down at the ranch. But we'll also have a virtual participation element to that. So for those of you who are either unable to join in person or uncomfortable joining in person, you'll be able to participate in that as well. It'll be held from 1 to 3 o'clock on October 28th. And so be on the lookout for that announcement coming out shortly. And I think what it'll tie in with nicely with some of the comments that we're seeing in the chat, we'll be talking about the American Rescue Protection Act, ARPA money, how those dollars are being allocated and priorities that are being identified for the use of those funds, as well as remaining CARES Act dollars. And then it will tie in with a healthcare summit that's actually taking place earlier in the day at the Embassy Suites. So we'll be talking about the intersection between health, both physical and mental health well-being, and its intersection with housing and some of the conditions that have been brought on through this pandemic and public policy response. So it should be a very robust conversation, and look forward to seeing you at that event. And with that, unless they have any final comments from our presenters, I think they've all spoken out.
Thanks
But,
again, Joe, for including us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you very much. We appreciated being here.
Yes, thanks, Joe. Great discussion, everybody. It's always great when we can unite as one region on an issue that's clearly a regional issue, like workforce and others. So great to be with y'all.
Terrific. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Hey, Joe, there's a question about what time on October 28th?
1 to 3 p.m. 1 o'clock to 3 p.m. Or for those of you who work in military time, 1300 to 1500 hours.
Thanks for the assist there, Sue.
Thank you.